World of Photography's first stop in search of offbeat equipment took our cameras to Shea Stadium in Queens, New York.
I spent about 3 months calling East Coast, West Coast, all the large cities to see if I could find a circuit camera. I called used camera stores, I called, new places, everything. And sometimes you found somebody that had heard of it or had even seen one, but nobody had one. Well, eventually I called a guy in Omaha, and he had one that had been restored, somewhat restored, and was in working condition. And he named his price, and I paid the price. They're really kind of rare. There aren't many people in the country that use them. As near as I can tell, it was made in the 20s, 1920, and there was a succession of companies that made them. There was a Century camera company. There was Kodak. Ultimately, was the last company making them, and when they quit making them, that was it, and that was in the 1940s.
Brad LePayne shot opening day of the 1986 World Series for the New York Mets. The exciting panoramic spectacle that LePayne captured with his circuit camera was so successful that the team management invited the Chicago-based photographer to return and shoot the opening day 1987 festivities. Since the final panoramic prints will be contact printed, LePayne has to be absolutely sure that the camera is level.
When I bought the camera, it was all the original stuff. The legs had been sanded and revarnished. Some screws were missing, and I could tell because they didn't match exactly. So everything had been put back together. New leather covering on the outside, new bellows. It got a new bellows, right down to everything. But the original case for the camera itself had been lost, so I had one of those made up, custom case made up. When you turn the camera on and expose film, you're in effect, the camera moves, and in effect, you're wiping the image onto the film, because as the camera moves, the film moves, and you expose a different part of the film as the camera moves. Before, just until recently, Kodak would sell the film only in an entire emulsion run, which is $3,000–4,000. I don't know, I didn't ever try to buy it because I bought it from people who did buy it that way. Now, just recently, Kodak has started selling individual rolls again. And I don't know whether, different people have called and asked for it or demanded it or asked why we couldn't get it, and so now they have. But only one type, and only VPS. The way I get my exposure is to take a 35mm camera that has a spot meter built into it and take a reading from the field, from 2 or 3 different areas of the grandstand, and from the sky, and then I average the readings in my mind or whatever and set the aperture accordingly. And today was a good day because it was cloudy. It was all pretty flat lighting, so it wasn't a big problem.
Since the shutter of the circuit camera remains open for the entire exposure, LePayne regulates the exposure by varying the speed of the camera's rotation. A series of gears which are attached to an enclosed motor drive the camera at various speeds. The combination of rotation speed and aperture give the photographer a wide range of exposure options. Once the proper size gear is selected and the limits of rotation are set, LePayne winds the spring-driven motor.
I think it's common among people who do photography that they always want a wider angle view, but they don't want the distortion. That's exactly what the camera does. You can take a few degrees angle of view, or you can take a full 360 degrees angle of view with this camera, and it doesn't have the distortion that which would normally be a characteristic of, say, a fisheye lens or an extreme wide angle.
Satterwhite on color and design. Al Satterwhite's book on the how-tos of successful commercial photography. As a strictly 35mm photographer, Satterwhite was faced with an interesting problem on being assigned to shoot a series of billboards for the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics.
This is a wide camera. It looks like a stretched version of a 35mm, and that's what it is. It's a 35mm camera that's been cut in half, gutted, shutter taken out, mirror box taken out, stretched apart and reconstructed. It's basically a film transport now. You've got two interchangeable lenses that fit on it. 65 millimeter, which is about normal focal length, fits on. Has a focusing mount down to about 4 feet. Has a contour shutter from a 5/100th of a second down to a second. You can sync strobe at any of those speeds. You've got a bubble level. You've got a viewfinder, optical viewfinder you can see through. It's very accurate. Then if you want to change lenses to a slightly longer focal length, 135, which would be like a medium telephoto, similar to the other mount, focusing down to 10 feet. Also a contour type shutter from 5/100th of a second down to 1 second, syncs the strobe at any speed, a bubble level, and also an optical viewfinder system to show you what you're shooting. The 65 millimeter lens being very susceptible to flare, I designed a strange looking lens hood for it. Basically made it out of black tape and board until I got it the way I wanted, and then had it reconstructed in metal. Since the format on the camera is 3 frames wide, instead of getting 36 frames to a roll, I now get 12 exposures, 12 frames to a roll. And you have to wind, well, in effect, you give it 3 strokes every time you want to wind the camera. In effect, what you're doing is taking a slice out of a 4x5, but while 4x5 film gives you a big image, they don't make 25 ASA type film in 4x5. So that's what I'm gaining on my end. Plus I'm also gaining the flexibility of being able to use the camera in the field, from moving cars, moving boats, helicopters, where it might be a little ungainy with a 4x5 trying to do that in the field. And the entire camera is set up that way. The focusing system has been checked with a tape measure, so I can guesstimate, or we can take the back off, use a ground glass back, and use it as a view camera to check focus and check critical edge lines. So it can be used one of 2 ways or both ways.